Open your refrigerator right now in your mind and picture what's inside it. Somewhere in there, almost certainly, is a carton of milk. Somewhere is a bag of white rice or white bread. Somewhere, if you're honest, is something with sugar listed in the first three ingredients and something salted enough that it doesn't need refrigeration at all. Now picture my kitchen 40 minutes from Naha in the house my husband and I built in 1958. There is no milk in my refrigerator. There has almost never been milk in my refrigerator in 68 years. There is no white bread. The rice we do eat sits beside a much larger pot of purple sweet potato, the way it has in this house since before I was born. And there is nothing in any cupboard sweetened the way the food in your kitchen very likely is. I am not telling you this so you feel guilty about your refrigerator. I am telling you because 5 ordinary foods you probably ate this week without thinking twice, have never been a regular part of the traditional diet on this island. And the scientists who have spent 50 years studying why people here love so long keep landing on the same short list again and again as one of the biggest reasons. I want to walk you through exactly which 5 and exactly why, because I don't think eat healthier is useful advice to anyone. It's too vague to anyone. What I can give you instead is specific. The 5 things missing from my table and what has sat in their place for generations instead. My name is Sachiko Uehara. I am 92 years old. I have never been a nutritionist. And until researchers started arriving here decades ago with their questionnaires and their notebooks, nobody in my village thought of what we ate as a diet at all. It was simply what there was to eat, shaped by this soil, this climate, and a great deal of hardship in years I'm old enough to remember firsthand. Before I give you the list, I want to be honest about something because I think honesty matters more than a tidy headline. Japan's average life expectancy is genuinely the highest of any major country in the world, around 85 years, compared with about 79 or 80 in the United States. That's roughly 5 to 6 years. And when researchers measure not just years alive, but years lived in good health, the gap grows even larger, closer to 9 years. Those numbers are remarkable on their own. They are not 30 years. I'd rather tell you the true number and have you trust everything else I say than tell you an exaggerated one and lose that trust the moment you looked it up yourself. What made Okinawa famous specifically within Japan is that for decades our life expectancy ran even higher than the already remarkable national average, and our concentration of people living past 100 was higher than almost anywhere else studied on Earth. Researchers led by Dr. Makoto Suzuki began the Okinawa Centenarian Study in 1975, and it remains the longest continuously running study of centenarians anywhere in the world. What they found again and again when they measured what people here had actually been eating for most of their lives was a diet defined less by what was on the plate than by what had never been allowed near it. Here is the first food, and I suspect it will surprise you the least and matter the most: refined sugar. The traditional Okinawan diet, measured by the researchers who studied it most closely, gets roughly 85% of its calories from carbohydrates, but carbohydrates from root vegetables and whole grains, not from anything resembling the added, refined sugar most of the world eats today. Artisanal sweets here were rare, small, and usually built around fruit or a small amount of raw cane sugar, not the engineered confections most of the world now treats as an everyday food. I want to tell you something about sugar that I only learned myself a few years ago because I think it explains a great deal about why so few people question how much of it they eat. In 1965, the sugar industry in the United States quietly paid a group of Harvard researchers to publish a scientific review that downplayed sugar's role in heart disease and shifted the blame heavily toward fat instead. This wasn't rumor or suspicion. It was confirmed decades later in 2016 when historians going through old industry documents found the internal correspondence and published it plainly in a major medical journal for anyone to read. For roughly 50 years, an entire generation of nutrition advice was shaped in part by a payment nobody was told about. I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because I think it explains something important. The reason so many of us grew up believing sugar was a harmless treat rather than something to be genuinely cautious about is not an accident of ignorance. Real money was spent deliberately to make sure we believed exactly that. Here on this island, none of that campaign ever needed to succeed because refined sugar was never inexpensive or plentiful enough to become an everyday habit in the first place. What grew here abundantly instead: Bitter melon, sweet potato, seaweed simply took its place at the table without anyone needing to be convinced of anything. I remember the first time I truly understood how differently sugar sits in other parts of the world. My granddaughter visited from abroad a few years ago and brought a box of sweets as a gift out of kindness, the way you might bring flowers. I tasted one and had to set it down. It wasn't unpleasant. It was simply so much sweeter than anything I'd grown up eating that my mouth genuinely didn't know what to do with it. She laughed and told me that where she lives, that level of sweetness is considered ordinary, the kind of thing found in a children's snack rather than a special treat. I've thought about that moment often since. An entire generation in many parts of the world has had its sense of normal sweetness quietly recalibrated upward, one small engineered product at a time, until a piece of fruit can taste almost bland by comparison. The second food is one that surprises visitors more than almost anything else I tell them: red meat, eaten as an everyday food. I want to be precise here because I don't want to overstate this one. Meat was never entirely absent from this island. Pork, in particular, has deep roots in Okinawan cooking, used in slow-cooked dishes for celebrations and special occasions for generations. What was absent historically was meat as a daily habit, the way it became normal across much of the modern world in the 20th century. Researchers studying the traditional diet found lean fish and modest amounts of lean meat eaten regularly, but red meat, in the quantities many households now consume several times a week, simply wasn't part of ordinary life here. It was food for a wedding, a festival, a rare and looked forward to occasion, not a Tuesday. The difference matters because of what tends to travel alongside a daily red meat habit: higher saturated fat intake, and in the traditional Okinawan diet, saturated fat made up only about 2% of total daily calories, a strikingly small share by almost any modern comparison. My own mother cooked pork exactly twice a year that I can remember clearly from childhood, once at New Year, once at the Harvest Festival. And each time it was treated as an event worth planning for, not a convenience worth grabbing on the way home from work. The dish itself, a slow-simmered pork belly we call refute, took the better part of a day to prepare, which I think mattered as much as the meat itself. When something takes an entire day of a household's attention to make, it simply cannot become an everyday habit, no matter how much anyone might enjoy it. I've often wondered whether some of what makes a food occasional isn't really about the food at all, but about how much effort still stands between wanting it and having it, and where that effort has disappeared, where meat is as fast to prepare as anything else on the plate. The occasional habit seems to quietly become a daily one, almost without anyone deciding it should. The third food is full-fat dairy, and this is the one that tends to genuinely shock people from other parts of the world because dairy is treated almost as a food group of its own in much of the West. There has never been a significant dairy tradition on this island. No cattle farming culture, no cheese-making tradition, no glass of milk with dinner, the way it became standard in so many households elsewhere in the 20th century. It isn't that dairy is forbidden or feared here. It's simply that it was never woven into the food culture the way it was in places with long dairy farming histories, and so it never became a habit anyone had to break. There's a biological piece to this worth mentioning honestly, because I don't think it's simply a matter of preference or tradition alone. The ability to comfortably digest milk into adulthood depends on an enzyme called lactase, and across much of East Asia, including here, the majority of adults naturally produce far less of it than populations with long histories of dairy farming, such as much of Northern Europe. In other words, a food culture with almost no dairy tradition and a population that, on average, doesn't digest dairy especially comfortably arrived at the same outcome from two different directions, one cultural, one biological, reinforcing each other over many generations until dairy simply never became embedded here the way sugar and rice eventually threatened to. The fourth food takes a bit more explaining because it isn't a single food so much as a whole category most people don't think to question: heavily salted and preserved food. This one is particularly interesting because it sets Okinawa apart even from the rest of Japan, not just from the West. Mainland Japanese cooking leans heavily on soy sauce, miso, and pickled vegetables, all of which carry substantial sodium. In mainland Japan has historically had some of the highest salt intake in the world, closely tied to elevated stroke risk in certain regions. Okinawan traditional cooking, by contrast, was measured by researchers at under 6 grams of salt per day, noticeably lower than the mainland Japanese average, achieved instead through the liberal use of vinegar, citrus, garlic, and a local citrus fruit called shikuwasa to bring flavor to food without reaching for the salt dish. I noticed this difference plainly the one time I traveled to visit family in northern Japan, many years ago now. The food was delicious, and I don't say any of this to criticize it, but I remember feeling almost thirsty after nearly every meal in a way I didn't nearly every meal I didn't at home, noticing how much saltier the pickled vegetables and the miso soup tasted compared to the version my own mother made. My cousin there laughed when I mentioned it and told me she'd always assumed all Japanese cooking tasted roughly the same. It was the first time either of us had really considered that two regions of the same small country could have developed such different relationships with salt, simply through what grew easily in each place. Abundant citrus and vinegar here, a longer tradition of salt-preserved food to survive harsher winters there. The fifth food is the one people find hardest to believe because it's treated as an unquestioned staple almost everywhere else in the world. Refined white rice is the primary source of daily calories. I want to be careful here because rice is absolutely part of Okinawan cooking and always has been. What's different is what rice's role actually was historically compared with what most people assume. For most of this island's history, particularly through the difficult years around and after the Second World War, it was purple and white sweet potato, not rice wheat, that supplied roughly 60% of daily calories in the traditional diet. A far larger, less refined, more fiber-rich, and more nutrient-dense source of carbohydrate than polished white rice, which digests quickly and offers comparatively little beyond calories once the fiber and nutrients have been milled away. Rice held an important place at the table, but it was never carrying the caloric weight that white rice or refined wheat carries in so many diets today. The sweet potato became central here largely out of necessity rather than any deliberate wisdom. It grows reliably in poor, free soil where rice cultivation struggles, and it survived the typhoons that regularly devastated other crops. What began as the plant that simply refused to fail, generation after generation, quietly became the foundation of a diet that outlasted, in terms of the health of the people eating it, the more prestigious grain sitting beside it on the plate. I find something worth sitting with in that. The food my grandmother's generation ate mostly because they had no better option turned out, by pure chance, to be considerably better for them than the food they might have preferred had poverty allowed them the choice. So there is the list. Refined sugar, red meat as an everyday habit, full-fat dairy, heavily salted and preserved food, and refined white rice as the primary calorie source. 5 things that were simply never built into daily life here the way they were nearly everywhere else in the 20th century, replaced instead by sweet potato, bitter meal, tofu, seaweed, and fish. I notice, looking at that list now as a whole, rather than one food at a time, that none of these 5 are foods traditional Okinawan cooking rejected out of any particular wisdom about nutrition. Nobody here was reading a scientific paper deciding to avoid saturated fat. They were foods that were simply too expensive, too impractical, too foreign, or too unnecessary to become habits, given what already grew easily and cheaply on this island. The diet researchers now study so carefully wasn't designed. It was inherited almost by accident from generations who never had the luxury of choosing otherwise, and it happened, by whatever combination of climate and circumstance, to be extraordinarily good for the people who lived on it their whole lives. I want to be honest with you now, because I think a tidy list like this can accidentally suggest something too simple, and I don't want to leave you with that impression. This list did not, on its own, create Okinawa's longevity. Researchers are consistent about this. Diet is one piece of a larger picture that also includes daily physical movement built into ordinary chores, lifelong social circles that check on each other, a sense of purpose that rarely disappears with age. And yes, genetics play some role too, though a smaller one than most people assume. There has also been real, serious scientific debate in recent years about how accurately some historical centenarian records were kept in several of the world's so-called blue zones, Okinawa included. And I think an honest telling of this story has, to acknowledge that debate rather than pretend it doesn't exist. Some researchers have raised legitimate questions about record keeping in earlier decades, particularly around very old birth records from before consistent national registration existed, and I don't think it does anyone any favors to wave that concern away simply because it complicates a tidy story. What I can tell you with more confidence, because it doesn't rest on the exact age of any single centenarian, is the more modest and, I think, more useful claim: populations eating diets resembling the traditional Okinawan pattern, high in vegetables and unrefined carbohydrates, low in the 5 categories I've described, consistently show lower rates of the diseases that shorten most lives in wealthy countries, heart disease and type 2 diabetes chief among them. That pattern holds up across many different populations studied around the world, not only here, which is precisely why I trust it more than any single disputable birth record from a small island 70 years ago. But here is what I find most convincing, more convincing than any single study. What happened here on this island itself, within living memory, when these 5 foods stopped being absent. After the Second World War, American military bases brought fast food, canned meat, and processed convenience food to Okinawa in a way the rest of Japan encountered more slowly and more gradually. Spam, in particular, became so embedded in local cooking here after the war that many households still use it today, folded into stir fries the way a vegetable might be. A small, telling sign of how thoroughly that era reshaped what ordinary food meant on this island. Over the following decades, younger generations here began eating noticeably more red meat, more refined sugar, more fast food, and the result showed up plainly in the data. By 1985, Okinawan men ranked first in life expectancy among all of Japan's 47 prefectures. By the year 2000, they had fallen to 26. Japanese public health researchers gave this decline a name, the 26 shock. And a study published in 2020-24 confirmed the pattern with real precision. Okinawans born before the Second World War have continued to show the island's traditional longevity advantage, while those born after 1980, raised on a very different plate, now die younger than the average for Japan as a whole. I find that comparison more persuasive than almost any laboratory study because it isn't a study of some other population far away. It's my own island, my own generation against my grandchildren's generation, eating differently for no reason more complicated than convenience, and the advantage that took my grandmother's generation a lifetime to earn, disappearing within about 1 generation of my own family's plates changing. I want to close this part honestly. None of this means any of these 5 foods is poison in small amounts, or that a slice of cheese or a hamburger now and then undoes a life. What the evidence suggests again and again is that habit is what matters, what sits on the plate most days for decades, not what appears occasionally. The traditional Okinawan diet wasn't a diet at all, in the sense of a plan someone chose. It was simply what was available, repeated for a very long time, and it happened to be remarkably good for the people who ate it. If you'd like to try something closer to what generations here actually ate, I'd suggest starting small the way I would with anything. Replace some of the white rice on your plate with a baked sweet potato, orange or purple, a few times a week. The fiber alone will change how your body handles it. Reach for rice vinegar, garlic, ginger, or citrus before you reach for the salt. Treat red meat the way it was treated here for most of history, as an occasion, not a daily habit, and let fish and plant protein like tofu take up more of the ordinary week. Read the ingredients on anything sweet before you eat it, simply out of curiosity about how much sugar is actually there, and let that curiosity, rather than any rule, guide how often you reach for it. And if dairy has never been something your body handles easily, know that an enormous number of people around the world share that experience for reasons written into their own biology, not any failing of willpower. I'd suggest picking one of these 5, not all of them at once, and giving it a full month before deciding whether it's worth keeping. My own granddaughter, after that visit with the too sweet gift box, told me she went home and simply stopped keeping soft drinks in her house. Not from any dramatic reason, just a quiet decision that she'd rather not have them within easy reach. She told me a year later that she barely thinks about it now, that the habit of reaching for one had simply faded once the option wasn't sitting there each evening. I think that's closer to how most lasting change actually happens than any of us like to admit. not through willpower exercise meal after meal, but through quietly changing what's easiest to reach for and letting time do the rest of the work. None of this requires living on a tropical island, or being Japanese, or having a grandmother who cooked this way. It requires deciding meal by meal what sits on the plate most often. That decision was made for my generation quietly, by geography and hardship, long before any of us understood why it mattered. I'd like to think you can make it on purpose, with the advantage of already knowing. Tell me, if you'd like, which of these 5 is already missing from your own table, and which one would be hardest to let go of. I read what people share. This time, I'd like to show you exactly what to sit on my table on an ordinary Tuesday, from the moment I wake up to the moment I stop cooking for the day. Not a recipe exactly, just an ordinary day of eating, the way it's looked in this kitchen for most of my life. Thank you for sitting with me this morning.